consequences. Oh, joining us to discuss the topic, in Washington, D.C., Christopher Chivers, a political scientist at the RAND Corporation. In London, Alan Mendoza, co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. And in Paris, Thomas Klau, head of the European Council on Foreign Relations in Paris. Well, the Obama administration, which tends to choose its words very carefully, has continually used the word partnership rather than relationship in characterizing its alliance with the UK. Christopher Chivers in Washington, is there a particular significance in this semantics?
Well, I wouldn't make too much of these words. I mean, I think that the special relationship has to be put in the context of the broader transatlantic relationship, which I think is basically very strong. The basic relationship between the United States and Europe, between the United States and the UK, is very strong in terms of trade, political ties, common history, and common culture. Now, we have seen some frictions in the relationship, but these frictions are almost exclusively over how to deal with problems elsewhere in the world. And I think that the fact that the United States and Europe are even discussing these issues elsewhere in the world is just a reflection of how deep and how strong the transatlantic relationship is. So that's a long way of saying that I wouldn't put too much stock in these small changes in semantics.
Alan Mendoza, your view of semantics between partnership and relationship?
Well, I think there's probably a little more to it than Christopher may have put down to. I mean, the view over here is very different. I think we've been rather alarmed by the rhetoric coming out of Washington towards the special relationship over the past few months of the Obama administration. Certainly, yes, there remains a commitment, of course, to Europe, but it's quite clear that in the language used towards Britain, some of the actions that have occurred towards Britain, certainly and particularly under the Brown-Obama relationship, there's been a sort of change of thought in Washington as to how it views Britain and indeed its European allies full stop. It wouldn't perhaps be too far to say that the administration has somewhat downgraded its European ties in favour of looking elsewhere around the world. That said, it's a new Prime Minister here in Britain, and there are early signs that perhaps the administration is changing its tune on that, and would like to assess that a bit further.
Well, Thomas Klau, in Paris, President Obama has referred a lot to the European Union, a phrase that many previous U.S. presidents have not always used. Is he perhaps shifting his attention from that specific relationship with Britain to a wider one with Europe in general?
Well, I think that's right in a sense, and as you just said, President Obama is acutely aware, if you want to put it that way, of the existence of the European Union. And indeed, it was a little noted fact, but I thought very striking, that in one of the earlier pre-presidential debates in the primaries, when he hadn't secured the Democratic nomination yet, and when he was being asked who, if he did become president, nominee first and then president, his partner of choice would be, he said the European Union, which was rather an extraordinary thing, in a sense, if you like, for an American politician to say. He didn't even say Europe, was the European Union. Now, I think what has happened since is that Obama, and with him a large part of the administration, have been really rather disappointed in the European Union not sufficiently getting its act together, still trying to crowd the photo with too many European faces, and despite having finally adopted the Lisbon Treaty, which of course is supposed to give Europe a single voice, a single face, a more united policy in terms of its engagement with the rest of the world and the United States, the reality, of course, hasn't lived up to expectations. And I think what we're seeing is signs of American frustration with the Europeans and tough love, if you like.
Well, Christopher Chivers in Washington, we heard a reference there to a new administration in the United Kingdom, David Cameron coming into power. Is there the view from Washington that perhaps perhaps a redefining of the relationship may be underway with the new British government?
Well, I mean, I'd like to respond a little bit to what some of my colleagues have just said in London and in Paris. I mean, I think that, you know, on the one hand, I disagree with the idea that President Obama is somehow neglecting the special relationship in favor of a closer relationship with continental Europe. I do think that it's important to recognize that President Obama is, of course, very popular in continental Europe and understands the potential role that the European Union can play in the world. and for that reason has obviously tried to focus to a certain degree on developing that relationship and continuing to deepen it. But nevertheless, I mean, when it comes to the main security challenges that we face in the world, particularly in South Asia, it's still the British that are able to contribute the most in terms of troops and that tend to share the same common view with the United States. So I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that somehow at present, or even under the Obama administration, there has been a shift away from the UK towards Europe. Now, I do think that it is true, however, that the United States is increasingly focused on problems elsewhere in the world, and that some of these problems may be of a character that our European allies, both British and continental European, are not able to contribute as much as some in Washington would like.
Thomas Klau, would you like to follow up on that?
Well, no, I think it's absolutely right. We are in a world which is rapidly changing, and even over the course of the last 2 years, we have seen countries like Brazil deploying what you could call a global diplomacy, Turkey becoming much more active in its own neighborhood and beyond, not unafraid to confront the world's major powers in terms of taking a different stance towards one of the most burning policies on the agenda, like Iran. So it is a changing world. I think the Obama administration is acutely aware of the fact that we've entered a new historic era. We may be seeing the end of 500 years of, if you like, Western dominance of the globe, and that is now, I think, coming to an end with new non-Western powers being active on a global scale in a way that hasn't really happened for centuries. So it's a fundamental realignment which is going on. Britain, of course, does have, in a sense, if you like, a special relationship with the US, which is founded partly on very specific agreements to share intelligence, although there have been many British disappointments about the Americans not always being as forthcoming with information as the British would like. Important technicalities about the British nuclear defense systems not being able to operate as independently as the French, needing American partnership. And of course, there is the British readiness historically, or certainly in post-war history, to engage militarily overseas much more readily than all other EU countries, EU partners, with the exception of France. But now, of course, Britain is entering into a period of severe budgetary constraints, as are many other countries. So that is an important part of the relationship, which we might see shifting with possible implications for the relationship between Washington and London.